1999, a novella by Erik E. Hanberg. Will's first time through 1999, what he and everyone later came to think of as 1999A, was a better year than he could have hoped for. His good year started, as years often do, in the final hours of the previous year, because that was when he met Erin. Before they met, Will had spent the New Year's Eve party wandering the halls, looking for familiar faces and coming up empty. The party was hosted by Will's junior-year roommate, Caleb, but Will was evidently one of the few friends Caleb had kept in touch with over the past 5 years. Most of the guests were co-workers from Caleb's new job, some hawkish think tank that paid Caleb handsomely to generate white papers and polemics about the threat of a rising China. With few people he knew, Will focused on the home. Caleb had plowed his high salary into a mortgage for a sprawling home in suburban Maryland, just outside of D.C. The home looked to Will like his 27-year-old friend was prematurely married and thought about nothing else except how to grow his 401k. He found the parlor, and with the dark wood and adult-level couches, it could only be described as a parlor, and that was where he discovered Erin, sitting alone, an ornate book from the ornate bookshelf on her lap. They stumbled over introductions. She explained how a co-worker at her lab liked a guy who would be here and how she had asked Erin to come for support, but then promptly forgot her. She was just killing time until she could go home. Perhaps it was the setting, or perhaps it was a quiet earnestness in her that caught his attention, but she looked radiant. The overstuffed room made her a study in contrast, emphasizing her trim figure, trim clothes, trimmed bangs, and the strong cut to her jawline and cheekbones. He felt the attraction instantly. Will left and returned with a bottle of wine and a second glass for her. Each glass had a wine charm around its stem, and he marveled at the mind of the single man who had somehow thought ahead enough to buy them. They spent the rest of the party together on that dark leather couch. They shared their biggest dreams. As a recent PhD in theoretical physics, she wanted to make a massive dent in humanity's understanding of the nature of the universe. He told her how he wanted a bookcase filled with awards from a career producing a cable news show, a dream Will mostly made up on the spot to try to match the grandness of Erin's. And they filled the time in between those talks about big dreams and big ideas with inconsequential details, like comparing charms in the wine glasses. Will's charm was a perky pewter koala, hers a sleepy and wizened owl. That first moment of 1999, right as the ball dropped on TV, they were sharing a chaste but passionate kiss, a kiss that was filled with the promise of a new relationship. They would return to that kiss for decades, greeting each new 1999 with their lips together. Over the first few months of 1999A, Will and Erin spent as much time together as they could, which wasn't much. They were both in the throes of careers that demanded their time. His job as a producer of a cable network's DC bureau kept him plenty busy. 80-hour weeks were not uncommon, but somehow Erin's schedule was even busier. He visited her at work once, imagining that a theoretical physicist would have amazing Star Trek-level equipment in her office. He was disappointed to discover that the tools she used most were the keyboard, mouse, and Windows 98. It was nearly the same setup as his own, except she used them to study the experimental data that was shipped to her on zip drives from far-flung places like Switzerland or the South Pole. He just sent a lot of emails and wrote up pitches for segments. It was a magical time, though, when they found the hours to spend together at least. They would sneak away from their jobs and have sex or just lie in bed and recapture the ease they had felt that first night together. It seemed as if they were having an affair, but with no partners to be injured by their stolen moments. Everything changed in early April, when Erin told him that her consulting contract with the feds was due to lapse. Rather than extend it for another year and remain in D.C., she was relishing the chance to get back to her lab at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. But, of course, she would come see him, and he was welcome to visit her. People made long-distance relationships work all the time. Will never asked her to stay. He implied it. He hinted. He let silences get long enough that he felt they were awkward, but he never asked. They'd been dating for less than 4 months. It was too much to put on her, wasn't it? If he actually articulated his feelings into words and asked her to stay, it would reveal that he was more invested in the relationship than she was, which must be true, he thought. Her leaving was evidence enough. And so she left her apartment at the end of the month and returned to Carnegie Mellon and the city of bridges. Their long-distance relationship lasted until June. She visited D.C. twice. He made it to Pittsburgh once. A fair trade, he felt, since she was the one who left. But their stolen moments were now stolen weekends, and they started to feel like a forced march, each of them waiting for Sunday afternoon or evening. They had good to see you again sex at the start of the visit, but it was nearly an obligation, not the reuniting of two lovers. With that out of the way, it was as if they'd run out of ideas. In D.C. again, she told Will she wanted to see the panda Sing Sing at the National Zoo, and so they went. For some reason, being at the zoo and gawking at animals made Will feel like they were kindergartners on a field trip. The woman he'd fallen for was cooing over a bear, and not him. It made him sullen and moody like a child. In Pittsburgh, they went to Blockbuster and rented a stack of his favorite black and white noir movies. She was bored, and he kept having to explain who Bogey was talking to, causing him to step on all the gumshoe's best quips. With Aaron, the movies were just an exercise in plot, and the joy he usually found in them was gone too. He called her on a humid summer day and broke it off, wondering if she'd fight back. But she was apparently ready for it to be done too. She wished him well, and that was the end of it. 3 months later, Will was in the office working on a segment for the newscast about how the military was addressing the Y2K bug when he got a page that someone was waiting for him at security downstairs. Expecting a source in the lobby, he was surprised to discover a disheveled Erin instead. Will's heart leapt when he saw her, but given everything that had happened since they parted, he kept that to himself. She asked if he had a chance to talk, and he couldn't help but say yes. They found a coffee shop, and she explained the sudden realization she'd had the night before. She's been alone in her lab, and for the first time, she'd felt lonely. She wasn't just alone in her lab. She was alone in an entire city. She spent years in Pittsburgh for school, but somehow barely knew anyone. That's when the truth hit her. She'd made a terrible mistake. She shouldn't have left in the spring. She should have tried to make it work. If given the chance to do it all again, she'd still be with him. She knew that now. She'd taken an overnight train to see him because when the truth was so clear, she couldn't delay telling him. There was such clarity in her eyes. Will felt like a cad to tell her about Astrid, who he'd met in July. Astrid was available. Astrid was always game. She didn't have a demanding job. She clocked out of work and she was ready to party. She slipped into his schedule almost any time he called her. As he told her the news, Erin looked like she was folding up inside herself. The clarity on her face was replaced with a forced wall of understanding and encouragement. Of course, you should see how the relationship goes, she advised, like she was some sort of old friend now. There was an awkward hug and a peck on the cheek. Let me know if you're in town again, he said. It would be good to catch up. She promised she would. They never spoke again in 1999A. In November, Sing Sing died, and the National Zoo was left without any pandas from China. There was wide television news coverage, and Will produced several features for his network about the zoo, the pandas, and the potential for another pair coming from China. He and Astrid were still together, but every time Will worked on a story, he was tempted to call Erin and tell her to watch. Maybe if it went well, he'd suggest she come visit. But of course he didn't. As the end of the year approached, Will wondered if Caleb would throw another party, which might have brought with it the slim chance of bumping into Erin again. But when Will called his old friend, it turned out that Caleb had had a very different 1999 than Will. Caleb had been arrested for soliciting a prostitute on a street corner in June and summarily fired from the think tank for failing to uphold the morals of the organization. Will thought Caleb's Restart the Arms Race article was far worse than trying to pay for sex, but the retired generals in charge of the think tank apparently didn't think so. Caleb was contrite, pled guilty, and was sentenced to community service, but suddenly no one was hiring. Caleb was forced to sell his suburban dream home and move back in with his parents in New Jersey. No more New Year's Eve party. No more wine charms. And so when December 31st rolled around, it was just Will and Astrid, cozied up on his couch to watch Hitchcock's Rebecca on VHS. They paused the movie and flipped the TV over to watch the ball drop. In the final seconds of the year, Will thought it hadn't gone too badly. He'd produced good work at his job, and he felt good about his career, and he ended the year with a girlfriend who clearly liked being with him. Astrid might not set his heart on fire the way Aaron did, but they were easy together. They liked the same things, and they just worked. He pushed any doubts aside and focused on the positives. She looked up at him as the countdown came to an end. He kissed her, as tradition required. The air suddenly felt different. Will's clothes felt different on his back, and the kiss was different too. Exciting, not tender. Hesitant, not familiar. Full of potential, not memories. He opened his eyes and saw Aaron. They were in Caleb's parlor. 1999B had begun. Will stared at Aaron in bewilderment. She stared back. "How did we get back here?" he asked. "What happened? Did we just lose the entire year?" She looked stunned. "You remember too?" Aaron asked. "Of course I remember it. There was a whole year after this moment. We were together, then we weren't." "Then I came to try to get back together," Aaron finished. They both looked away from each other. "What the hell is going on? A whole year gone as if it didn't happen?" Will's memory caught up. He quickly got up from the couch they'd been sharing and put some distance between himself and Aaron. "Astrid." He reached for his cell phone but found an old model in his pocket. He'd upgraded it in the middle of the year, before he met Astrid. This one didn't have her number in it. Damn it, I don't even know how to reach her. He leaned against the bookcase for support, too shocked to know what to do next. From outside the room came the sounds of shouts and exclamations. Caleb suddenly poked his head around the doorframe. "You all okay in there?" "What day is it?" Will asked. "No, what year is it?" "I guess it's January 1st, 1999 again." Caleb shook his head in wonder, looking around at the walls. "I sold this place 4 months ago. I never thought I'd see it again." "How do we all remember an entire year that didn't happen?" Aaron asked, apparently to herself. No one could answer that. The voices from the other room got louder. "What's happening out there?" Will asked. "Remember that bad car crash that Peter and Sarah were in back in the spring? Drunk driver T-boned them?" Will shook his head. "Who?" Oh, right. I don't think you know him. Peter and I worked together. It was a terrible thing. They were driving home and the drunk ran a red light with his foot on the gas. Just awful. They lost their 3-year-old in the crash. Peter got really depressed after that. Blamed himself and his driving, even though it was entirely the other guy's fault. Sarah took a different approach and immediately checked herself into therapy. Toward the end of the year, she broached the idea of trying for another child, but he flipped and said she was dishonoring their daughter's memory. I don't know all the details, but it was a bad scene, I guess. Honestly, they were about ready to get a divorce. But now, Will prompted. The kid's alive, man. I was right there when she called home. Sarah got the babysitter on the line, and while the babysitter is freaking out, of course, just like everyone else, Sarah convinced her to check their daughter's room. The little girl is in the crib, asleep, like it never happened. Peter and Sarah are over the moon, screeching tires as they left to go see her, you know what I mean? He said with a laugh. They get a do-over, Aaron murmured. Before Will could say anything, another conversation interrupted them. He could hear voices approaching. I don't care, a woman shouted. You still cheated on me. Will saw them come by the parlor door behind Caleb. A man and a woman opened the coat closet across the hallway, never acknowledging that anyone was listening to their fight. It's a new chance to get it right, though, the man pleaded, getting her coat, which she snapped out of his hand. It still happened, Derek. You cheated on me last year. Or this year, or whatever it is. But you were cheating on me in 1998, too. She left, and he followed. The door slammed behind them. Y2K, man, Caleb said, shaking his head. He took a drink. I don't think anyone predicted it would cause this. It was meant as a joke, but it made Will remember the story he produced about Y2K. Couldn't be related, could it? There was no way. And then he remembered. The biggest news story of his life was unfolding in real time, and he was just standing around gabbing. I have to get to work. It's going to be all hands on deck. No, wait, Aaron said, grabbing his arm. What about us? Will had no idea what to say, but she kept going in the face of his silence. We get a do-over, too. The clock has started over. I won't leave my contract this time. I'll renew it and stay in D.C. I'm willing to commit. Let's try to get it right. Aaron, time didn't stand still. I mean, it sort of did, I guess, but I still remember what happened. It's not just water under the bridge. You left. You ended it, she shot back, and then found someone a hot second later. She stepped away, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. I know you might still be with her, but what was she doing at the beginning of last year before she met you? Who was she with? What decisions might she make differently now that we all get another shot at it? Do you know for sure that she's going to be waiting for you? Will opened his mouth and closed it again. He remembered that Astrid had transferred from D.C. to New York in the March of last year. This year. He remembered she had vaguely spoken about her most recent ex, but he wasn't quite confident about when exactly they'd broken up. So choose the person you want to be with, Aaron continued. The person you want to be with now. We're all getting another chance. Let's not waste it. Will bit his lip. He still went to work that night. He kissed Aaron, told her that they'd figure it out, and he covered the news of the second 1999 as best he could. His most reliable cameraman had switched jobs toward the end of 1999A and went to work for a different network. He showed up at work, and he was hesitant to do anything because he didn't know where he was actually employed. Will left him to his quandary. He grabbed a camera and headed out into the field on his own. That was his life for almost every waking moment of January 1999B. He eventually found a number for Astrid's office in New York. She wasn't with her ex, she told him. That had ended in 1998, but she was going to stay in the city and work, at least for a while. He asked what that meant for them, and she said they could talk about it if she ended up moving to D.C., but she just didn't know. Will decided that was enough of a farewell, and he grabbed at his chance to relive the year with Aaron. They spent more time together than they ever would have the first time around. That feeling of stolen moments with Aaron was now a stolen year. The panda Sing Sing had been restored to life, just like everyone else who had died in 1999A. They went to see him with the rest of the crowd. This time Will didn't feel like a child, but rather a tourist in his own backyard, witnessing something magical. Everywhere they looked, there were stories of second chances, and not just rekindled romances like their own. Those who had been cheated on, abused, or had otherwise discovered secrets about their partners during the course of 1999A had the chance to end those relationships early. New life was everywhere. Women who lost babies during childbirth went for early C-sections. Middle-aged men who'd had heart attacks started eating better immediately and taking medication early. They shed their pounds and largely avoided their fates. The rate of accidents dropped sharply across the board. In Taiwan, a massive government evacuation meant that an earthquake that had killed 2,400 people in September 1999A now killed less than 20 people, although a deadly quake in Turkey still killed 1,000. In the new 1999 because the evacuation had been so poorly managed. But that was down from 17,000 in 1999A, which made it feel like a tremendous success. And a deadly earthquake in Mexico somehow didn't happen in 1999B, which seismologists pledged to study until they understood the reason. With all that good news, living through 1999B was like a year of springtime. While Will and Aaron were acting like everything was new again, though, others were discovering that events in the gap year, as it was initially known, weren't so easily dismissed. Caleb found himself summarily fired. Again. He sued, claiming there was no evidence he had solicited a prostitute. And in fact, there wasn't. No police report, no mugshot. It was as if he'd never chatted up an undercover officer through his car window and been charged for it. But no one could forget. He was fired anyway. If you murdered someone in the gap year, could you walk free now if your victim was still alive? These questions began winding their way through the courts. Did a president acquitted of perjury and obstruction of justice in February 1999A need to be acquitted again in 1999B? The Republicans were talking about keeping the Clinton impeachment trial open. Maybe it would stick this time. And across the world, children everywhere had finished a school year and started a new one during the gap year. If you graduated high school in 1999A and went off to college, where would you go to school now? Especially if someone was already living in your dorm room on campus. It was generally deemed undesirable to force students to repeat a year of school, but it took most of January and February to sort it out. Most students advanced to a new grade, save for those who wanted an extra few months to catch up. And they hadn't really lost any time. It was an amazing chance to get all kids up a grade level, school district officials proclaimed. Employers were forced to honor job offers made to anyone during 1999A. Mostly this worked. By the end of the year, even folks like Caleb were able to get some legal protections and were entitled to wrongful termination lawsuits. And of course, all the programmers who worked on eradicating the Y2K bugs worked incredibly hard to fix them, again. Caleb had made a joke about it just minutes after 1999B began, but to many it wasn't a joke. Conspiracy theorists were convinced that computers had somehow screwed things up for everyone. Aaron didn't know whether to laugh or weep. Sure, because the fabric of space-time is affected by whether your VCR knows the right date or not. But some people took the Y2K theory very seriously, and were convinced that the repeated year was a plot by the programmers themselves, the reasons for which were never fully laid out in a way that Will understood. As the fallout from the gap year unfolded, Will covered it all. On the surface, his role as a news segment producer didn't change much. He'd previously worked with reporters, camera crews, and newspaper journalists to stitch together short news stories for a national cable TV audience. But now it felt like he was doing so much more. Everything seemed to be in flux. There were the normal ways of doing things, but none of them seemed to make sense anymore. People left their jobs, sometimes suddenly. Other times, new folks ended up thrust into the work environment with not much to do. We hired these people last year, and our force to employ them again was not a great recipe for team camaraderie. And yet, all in all, it was another good 1999 for Will. Even better than the first, really. Some folks obviously were sent reeling by the reboot. They were kicked out of their homes, or lost jobs, or were blamed for things that they simultaneously hadn't done, but also still remembered doing. But Will got to spend the entire year with Aaron. It was the year they could have had together the first time, and he loved it. Even Astrid made it a relatively easy transition when she told them she was going to stay in New York. The city felt more alive than it had last year, she said. But Will thought it wasn't the city that had changed, it was her. In the same way that D.C. felt new to him, upending their lives had an unexpected side effect. New memories, fresh perspectives, and an excuse to break out of old ruts. He wished her well. Caleb was even able to get a new job by the end of the year. Suddenly, something that happened in 1999A seemed like old news, and the world had moved on. And he offered all of his guests the chance to celebrate the year 2000 in the same place they had rung in the current year. He thought they could make it a tradition. Aaron and Will were in. There was a little gallows humor in it, but after the years they'd had, why not? They closed the book on 1999B in Caleb's parlor together. "Get ready," Will whispered. 5 seconds to go. "Just kiss me, you idiot," she said. So he did. They were kissing again. It was colder? Was that right? Aaron and Will separated. He bit his lip. They looked around the room. It was the same, wasn't it? Was it a new year or not? This bit of humor suddenly seemed like a terrible idea. Then it hit him. Oh, shit. We were sitting on opposite sides of the couch a second ago, Will said. And it was true. When he kissed her in 1999B, he'd had his left arm up on the back of the couch, but this time he was facing the other direction, and he had his right arm up, the same way it was the first time. Oh my God. We have to do it again, he whispered. Again. The whole goddamn year. Oh, no, Erin moaned. She tucked her face in her hands. The shouts from the other room started up again. They were more like screams this time. Will thought of Peter and Sarah, the couple who had discovered their child was still alive. He had just talked to Peter at the party only a half hour before midnight. They were raising a happy, healthy girl. She had gotten to turn 4 in 1999B, the father said, bursting with pride, and also tears. She didn't get to do that the first time through. Bullet dodged, right? But now she was going to turn 4. Again. What was that going to feel like for those parents, Will wondered. Their daughter killed one year, revived the next, and now, what? Stuck a toddler for how long exactly? Was that little girl going to be 3 going on 4 forever? Will felt the beginnings of a pit of dread forming in his stomach. Everyone could get behind a second chance. But what was the use of a second chance if you never got to make good on it? We're stuck in here, aren't we? He asked. It's not possible, Erin said through tears. It just can't be. Will went to put his hand on her, but she pulled away, sobbing. Erin ran from the room, and Will didn't see her again until 1999D. Sing Sing was shot in the head on January 6, 1999C. It was an omen, Will thought. The year that was clearly going to be bad may as well start with the assassination of a panda bear. The shooter had bought a ticket to the zoo like everyone else, except he pulled out a handgun while in the viewing area and took careful aim. 3 shots as the crowd scattered from him, taking cover. He was arrested almost immediately after, but it was too late for the panda bear. A video of his arrest showed him preaching to the officers around him. I have done a service to the world and to this bear. Sing Sing died. We all remember it. Sing Sing is supposed to be dead. Just like everyone else who died in 1999A is supposed to be dead. Keeping them alive is holding us all back from reaching the year 2000. He was swarmed by the officers, and that was the last anyone heard from him. Will regretted that he'd stayed on the panda beat. The year kept getting worse. The panda shooter was clearly crazy, but he didn't inspire a wave of similar killings against those who died in 1999A, even though anything seemed plausible now. Programmers, though, joined pandas on the list of endangered species. There were mass demonstrations against the programmers and Y2K, which somehow the protesters both simultaneously conflated together while also claiming the Y2K bug wasn't real and was just the excuse for what the programmers were doing now. As 1999C went on, there were several cases of beatings and even a few murders. Suddenly no one wanted to confess to working in tech. Will had the numbers. These weren't just rumors passed through friends of friends that ended up so often being apocryphal. He was an expert at tracking those stories down. No, these were well-documented slayings. Microsoft and IBM beefed up their security in response. This time around, Clinton was convicted and became the first president to be impeached and removed from office. Perjury and obstruction of justice might have nothing to do with the third go-around of 1999, but the national mood had soured and the politicians were scared. A president already dangling in the wind was an easy scapegoat. Al Gore was sworn in as the 43rd President of the United States on April 4, 1999C. Shortly afterward, he indicated that he would suspend his campaign for the presidency until the clock actually rolled over to 2000. In theory, he'd been running for the position since the middle of 1999A, and he was candid, in an interview with Diane Sawyer, that he was incredibly tired after 2 years of campaigning for an election day that, many now speculated, the world might never reach. A sitting president admitted that humanity could be stuck in the year 1999 did not go down well with the American public. You were used to presidents who could fix anything, or at least had the ambition to do so. The Republicans began drawing up new articles of impeachment shortly after. Students were advanced again. This time, everyone got the system. They'd built up another year of learning, but their bodies stayed the same. So far, it was mostly workable. The 16-year-old kids graduating high school were more mature and learned than a traditional 16-year-old, but they were still minors. Could they apply for jobs as if they were 18? Should they be sent to college? Many parents kept their kids out of college and out of the workforce. Many kids left anyway. No matter how much the 3-year-olds had learned in the last 2 years, though, many were simply not ready on a biological level for kindergarten. Even more parents kept their young kids at home, too, further disrupting the workforce. Some lucky folks eyed their bank accounts and elected to quit their jobs early in the year. If they had enough money to get through 1999, they realized they didn't need to save for 2000, because they got to start the year over again with the same amount of cash. If the years kept repeating, they got to begin a permanent vacation. Will didn't quit. He did his job as best he could. Whole industries were going through convulsions, trying to adapt to the sudden changes. Some disappeared overnight, others found new life. The news remained the news. People really liked watching TV, no matter how crazy the year was or what was happening to them personally. Through it all, he kept trying to reach Erin, except, so far as he could tell, she'd disappeared. Her D.C. apartment was empty. He called her lab at Carnegie Mellon, but her voicemail was full. In May, he pitched a story that would take him to Pittsburgh and used his time there to track her down. He found colleagues who had heard from her and one who had even seen her. Doing research of some kind, they thought, but they were all pretty vague. They were deep in their own work. All theoretical physicists had been trying to understand what was happening, and she was doing the same work as they. But now that he mentioned it, they said, they were surprised they hadn't seen her at all in 1999B. Will thought about that second chance year they had spent together. He realized the scientists were right. Erin hadn't been investigating the repeating year. Rather, she'd continued to do her own research. He wondered what that meant. A year is a long time, as Will learned. His emotions took him everywhere, pining for Erin in 1 month, anger in another, where he tried his best to wish her good riddance. He stumbled into some green shoots of jealousy for the life she was leading without him. And other times her disappearance was just a puzzle to be solved with a detached mind and a methodical search. There were even moments of acceptance and release. Why shouldn't she lead her own life for a year? She might even make a different choice if and when 1999 came around. But as the end of the year approached, and Will was quite certain it would be another 1999, not 2000, his mood shifted toward anticipation. A December Advent season, waiting not for Christmas but for the first few seconds of January 1999D. Because no matter what happens in between, he knew they'd continue to return to that moment, their lips together in a kiss. And then the waiting was over. Lips locked. Will enjoyed it while he could. This kiss lasted longer than the first time. He could feel the longing from her, too. She'd missed him as much as he'd missed her. They broke their kiss, but their foreheads stayed close. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi," he whispered back. And then, "Where have you been?" "Here," she said. "For a while." And then Pittsburgh again. "Here? And you didn't tell me?" "I'm so deep in research it doesn't matter where I am. That's all I'm focused on." "And?" "I don't have a good answer. Yet." "Does anyone?" "No, but there's hope." Will arched his eyebrows in surprise. On December 16th, 1999, what we all call 1999A, I guess, there was something called the Beethoven burst. A massive burst of gamma rays from somewhere in the Orion constellation, named for Beethoven because it was his birthday. Beethoven might be the only word that I understand. Gamma rays are unimportant to the story. They happen when really big things, like astronomically big things, explode. What is important, though, is that the burst was 10 billion light years away. It happened in 1999A, but it wasn't observed in 1999B or C. In fact, the readings astronomers gathered at the end of 1999C are consistent with a massive explosion 2 years before, which means that time isn't repeating everywhere. Exactly, Erin said, and her eyes flashed brightly. Will remembered all the times he'd seen that look, and he was hit with a pang of nostalgia and longing. Before he could acknowledge it, though, she continued, "Everything we're finding suggests that the effect is localized. Our solar system for sure, but it's hard to tell how much bigger. There's just not as much phenomena to study or measure between us and Alpha Centauri. That's the next closest star system. And there's a ton we don't know. Will the effect stay localized, or is it spreading at the speed of light? The speed of time? Is there such a thing? No one knows." "So what does that mean for us?" Will asked. "More research. We'll gradually build our understanding. Labs have brought in trained oral historians, if you can believe it, since our data doesn't move from one year to another. But just like any scientific work, we'll research and test hypotheses until we've cracked it," Erin said. "No, I mean, what does it mean for us?" he insisted. Erin nodded slowly. "More research," she repeated. "For me as well." "You're leaving again," he said, slumping back. "The sooner we crack it, the sooner you and I can move on," she said quietly. "It's not a pause, you know. Life still happens, even if the year stays the same. What if we lose what we had? What if we meet someone else?" Erin looked down at her open palms. I actually want you to." "I'm sorry? I want you to do something for me this year, okay?" He waited her out. "Get back together with Astrid for me," she said. Will couldn't even begin to understand it. "Really? With Astrid?" "Yes." "Erin, I don't want to be with Astrid. You know that. I want to be with you like we were the second time around." "I know. I want that too, but let me put it this way. I want you to be sure. I want you kissing her at the end of this year like you were the first time. It's not up to me, you know. She might have... I know, I get it, but I'd like you to try. For me, for us." Will sighed and looked away. "Did you know that I went looking for you? No one at Carnegie Mellon would tell me anything." "I heard." "Did you tell them to do that?" "No," she said with a firm shake of her head. "Honestly, they probably weren't paying attention. And I'm not in their meetings or anything. What I'm researching isn't through any program of study. I'm following my own line of inquiries and reasoning." "You're going to be the lone genius to save us all then?" "No," she said, and she looked pained in a way that he didn't understand. "The best science usually takes a team, I know that. But if I were in a university's program right now, I'd just be getting coffee for the people who are already at the top. I'm too young and the wrong gender for them to listen. I need data, real data." Will rubbed his face. "Okay, so here's the question. Why didn't you start working the first time we repeated a year? When 1999B started, I knew there was a story in it, a world transformational story, and I covered every angle of it, just like every other journalist on the planet. A repeated year must have been catnip to a theoretical physicist. And yet, you just stayed the course on your existing work. I never saw you get lost in this stuff the way you are now." There was a silence. "Is there a question in there?" Erin asked. "Why did you sit back during the first repeat? But when it happened again, you dove in head first, as you were apparently planning to do again." Erin got up. She tilted his chin and kissed him gently. "For you. For us. Will you promise? Promise? Astrid. Get together with her. Kiss her on New Year's Eve. See if she's right for you." People like it when things come in threes. Jokes, trilogies, stooges. Anything longer starts to become a laundry list. That's how starting 1999D felt. The first time through, the year was normal. The second time through, it was fresh and interesting and vibrant. The third time was filled with dread. The fourth just took that and amped it up again. and the effects of the repeating were no longer as easily managed. Kids who had started 1999A as freshmen in high school would graduate this year and start college. But who was going to apply? They had had 4 years of schooling trapped in their 14-year-old bodies. What was going to happen to them? Clinton resigned January 1st. Gore became president. The Republicans redrafted articles of impeachment and railed against a never-ending Democratic autocracy in which Election Day was always next year. Suicides spiked, made easier perhaps by the knowledge that they'd be back again. Although the murder rate continued to drop, the karmic consequences were too high when the person you murdered could come back and kill you the following year. The sole exception to the trend was the rising murders of those who had died in 1999A. The zookeepers at the National Zoo wisely kept Sing Sing out of the public view. Elsewhere, a small but fiercely determined faction came to believe that everyone who had died in 1999A must be dead for the world to move forward. They called themselves the Restoration. They weren't responsible for enough actual deaths to counteract the overall decrease in homicides, but it had had a chilling effect and drove hundreds of thousands of people into hiding. Countering them, another faction, or perhaps a church, arose that taught that the reputation of 1999 gave humans a chance to practice achieving nirvana. They called themselves the Enlightened. Their founder was a charismatic, obviously, and used the newfangled technology of the internet to spread his word. He preached in short, grainy videos that were shared on sites like Napster, which had launched to great popularity in 1999A and blossomed even more so in B, C, and D. The preacher asked his followers to consider the idea that perhaps what comes after the year 2000 is so terrible that someone who knew what was in store for us figured out a way to freeze the world's timeline at the last good year for humanity. Perhaps the year 1999 should be seen as a gift, not a curse. As President Gore, world leaders and business executives worked together to marshal the world's resources toward moving beyond 1999, this faction saw the repeating year as the first chance for a human to have eternal life. Our species has finally conquered death. And what is the first thing our leaders do? They seek to bring back the crush of time, aging, and death. I say no more. I'm going to party like it's... and so forth and so on. Will came to detest Prince's song about the end of the century, even as he and every other news producer found a way to reference it in their broadcasts. What worried Will most wasn't how extreme the factions and sects and cults were getting. Timothy McVeigh and Ted Kaczynski had been enough to convince Will that there were plenty of crazy people out there. That wasn't new. No, what scared him was how seemingly normal people were suddenly caught up in it. The way regular people took up these insane ideas was truly terrifying. In April, his boss pulled him aside at work and asked whether Will was interested in producing a segment about the Restoration. "We can't put those people on the air," Will said. "It'd be a disaster." "An even-handed exploration of their message," his boss answered. "That's all I'm suggesting. I'm not saying I believe in everything they're saying, but they make some interesting points, you know?" Will was scared to quit. He didn't want to kick himself for eternity for giving up a great job that reached a national audience just because his boss had gone off the deep end. But he was closer to walking out the door and living off his savings than he'd ever been before. In the summer, Will started to think about Astrid again. On New Year's Day, he'd told Erin he would seek her out, but he hadn't really meant to. Months later, however, the idea of someone to curl up with at night sounded much more appealing. These were hard times to go through on his own. And Erin was who knows where, doing God knows what. And she'd practically pushed him into Astrid's arms. He called Astrid and was pleasantly surprised to find she was in D.C. this time around. They met for a drink, and she told Will that she wasn't looking for anything exclusive. She was going to enjoy her life from now on. All her baggage was behind her in New York, and she didn't have time for Will to be jealous. He told her he had a girlfriend, but she was out saving the world and had given him the year off their relationship. Astrid laughed and downed her drink. "Then let's skip ahead a few hours. Your apartment's still close, right?" It was. Astrid was a changed woman. She'd slipped into his life so easily back in 1999A, but in D, he had trouble reaching her. She didn't defer to him as much, if at all. He hadn't even realized she had been doing it until getting back together with her. And if she got bored, she just left. She meant what she said. She'd found a freedom in the repetition. At the end of the year, he invited her over for another old movie. "Just the two of us tonight," he said. "Who knows if we'll be together next year?" "Is this a goodbye? Is your hall pass revoked?" Astrid asked. "I don't know, but we'll have a new start. We each get to decide what to do next year. You decide to learn flamenco in Spain, for all I know." She laughed and arched her hand up like a dancer. "And what makes you think I don't know it already?" On December 31st, they said goodbye and kissed as the year closed. Will was ready for the start of 1999E. When it came, he slipped one arm around Erin and held her firmly. "Don't go this time, please," he whispered. She pushed him. "What about Astrid?" Will leaned back. "What about her?" "You promised to get back together." "We did. Not to be weird, but we were just kissing a few seconds ago. Kissing goodbye. And yeah, it was a nice few months, but I don't want to be with Astrid. I want to be with you." Erin sort of fell into him. She hugged him tightly. He stroked her hair until she gently released him. "What was that, some sort of test?" he asked. "To see if I still wanted to be with you?" He felt her nod her head against his chest. "Something like that." "You don't have to worry. I'm in this for the long haul." "I'm so close, Will," she whispered. "We don't have much time." "What do you mean? All we have is time." Will shook his head. "You're talking about physics. I'm talking about psychology, biology. The two are in battle the way the human race has never experienced. Everyone's minds are aging, but our bodies aren't. Everything changes, but then nothing does. We can't cope with this. Something's going to snap." "I just need another year," she pleaded. She didn't get her year. In May, Russia sent nukes into China for some sort of dispute over land or oil or something that Will didn't catch. There wasn't time to understand it because things got bad quite quickly after that. China fired its nukes back. A few days later, India and Pakistan traded bombs, and then suddenly they filled the skies everywhere. Will was in D.C., an early target, and he died instantly. Most people in the Northern Hemisphere died quickly. The peoples of the Southern Hemisphere were spared the worst of it. None of the countries below the equator had nuclear weapons, and they didn't have any tantalizing targets that anyone in the global North particularly wanted to launch a missile at. But that only meant they survived long enough to get the worst of the nuclear winter: famine, radiation, and agony. No matter the hemisphere, the year brought with it death. 1999F couldn't come soon enough. Will felt like he was weeping the moment the new year began. Erin was crying too. Alive again. He felt the heaviness of the months he'd been gone, like he somehow could remember them passing while he'd been dead. "Where were you when—" he asked. "Pittsburgh again," she answered. "Were you in D.C.? He nodded. He was anxious, distraught, furious. He saw Caleb pass in the hall. "It's places like your think tank that led to that," Will hollered. Caleb looked shocked. "What? No! Will, you're playing God with your white papers and your strategy. There are laws that govern how nuclear weapons can be deployed. It's rigorously safeguarded by congressional legislation and the executive—" "Oh, shut up," Will spat. "Go pay someone to suck your dick." Caleb stomped off. "He wasn't the one who had the launch codes," Erin said quietly. "No, but he may as well have been. He's the window dressing for the people who do have the launch codes. He makes them feel like what they're doing isn't the worst thing in the world. The people at the top, they're all just children. Do you know what I think happened? I think these generals just wanted to see what would happen, just this once. They probably dressed it up as a strategic testing of their enemy's defenses, or a real-world war game where everyone gets an extra life when it's done. But at base, they're children who just wanted an excuse to finally push the big red button." Erin pursed her lips. Will sighed and leaned back on the couch. "I'll apologize to him," he said. "Next year, maybe." That caused her to smirk. "Did you learn anything?" he asked. "Before?" "Nothing certain, but maybe enough." Will sat forward. Enough to fix it? To move on? I don't know. Maybe it would involve extraordinary coordination, and maybe even some sacrifice. Explain it to me. Explain it to me like you're on the news and a bunch of non-scientists are watching us. Erin blew out a breath and her bangs fluttered. We're caught in a time loop, she started, like in that movie. But it's not a day, it's a year, he finished. And it's all of us who remember, not just one person. And she was nodding already. Exactly. Nothing anyone hasn't guessed at or felt. She went to an ornate desk that looked like it had been used for writing correspondences in the Victorian age. She grabbed a fancy pen and thick cotton paper. Okay, she said, drawing a line up the page. This is 1999. 1999A, I should say, normal time. But when 1999A ended, at the stroke of midnight Eastern Standard Time, a temporal anomaly pushed us back to the beginning of the year. The whole Earth, the solar system, maybe farther. Who knows? The point being, we all reset 365 days. She slashed a diagonal line down to the right. From there, she started another vertical line, creating an N shape. This is 1999B, moving forward, everyone trying to shake it off. And we get to the end of the year, and bam, we can't move forward, because the conditions at the end of 1999B don't match 1999A, so we revert again to the same instant. She slashed another line back. And we try again with 1999C, and so forth. She hurriedly drew a sawtooth shape, forward and then slashed back, forward and then slashed back. She continued. The key is to get it right. Get the conditions of 1999A right, and then the flow of time, here she drew the line continuing forward to the top of the page, can move forward as normal, no longer trapped in the N loop. He looked at the page and saw the repeating N shape, always stuck, never moving forward. But something in how she spoke made him afraid. What do you mean about getting the conditions right? Well, things changed in 1999B, right? Everything changed. And then again in C. We learned some lessons. Some people who were alive hadn't been. Some people died who hadn't died. Everything was different. We need to try to recreate 1999A as close as we possibly can before we forget it. The longer we go, the harder it will be to get it right. Will bolted up from the couch. Oh my God! You became one of the restoration kooks. He started pacing. Those people are part of a death cult, Will. They're murderers. That's not what I'm talking about. What are you talking about then? She rocked her head back and forth, weighing her words carefully. We need as many people as possible to be where they were at the end of 1999A. Will threw up his hands and paced again. I'm not crazy, she exclaimed. This is science. Will pointed down the hall. There are 2 parents out there who lost their 3-year-old girl in 1999A. Do they need to lose her again if we want to move forward? No. Well, probably not, Erin hedged. You have got to be kidding me. I don't know that everything needs to be exactly the same to clear up the anomaly, because I don't know what condition is holding us back. So we need everyone to do their best. No one should go out murdering people, I don't think. Why haven't I heard anyone else talking about this? All the governments and scientists in the world are working on this, but you're the only one who's come to this conclusion? They probably don't want to sound like they're part of the restoration either. Will tucked his arms in as tight as he could. Also, she drawled out in a tone that told him the real truth was coming, I have some information they don't have. Which is, I know why the temporal anomaly happened. The first time, the one that set us back to 1999B and started everything. Will felt himself go bug-eyed. You do? She nodded. Because I caused it. Will was having trouble processing that one. I'm sorry, what do you mean you caused it? Erin jumped up. Now it was her turn to pace as he stood stone still. Back in September 1999A, when I came to you and told you how I felt about you and my moment of absolute clarity, but I never told you what happened that triggered it. Erin described how she had been working alone in her Carnegie Mellon lab over that summer when she achieved a major breakthrough. Her big dream to put a massive dent in humanity's understanding of the nature of the universe much closer now, because she just proved that manipulating space-time was possible. After some successful experiments sending particles into the past, she decided to test her theory within the realm of Newtonian physics. Particles were one thing, but manipulating real objects in space-time was the key. She trained several cameras on an empty platform for 1 week, and then, when the week was up, she sent a block of ice into the past, back to the moment she had started to roll the tape. "Why a block of ice?" Will asked. Erin explained that she wanted to work with something physical, but that she also wanted to study something that was at least a little dynamic, something that would change its state twice if it arrived in the past: solid, liquid, gas. She reviewed the recording and watched as a block of ice appeared in an instant. There were no special effects. It was just, now it's there, in a way that was almost unsettling. Then, as the tape continued, she watched the ice melt and then eventually evaporate. When the week-long series of recordings neared its end, she watched herself place the block of ice on the platform and then watched it disappear in that same simple now-it's-gone effect. It had worked perfectly. She'd successfully completed a time travel experiment. At first, she was ecstatic. She was going to be one of the most celebrated scientists in the world. Ask any random person to name a scientist, and they'd say Einstein, maybe Newton or Galileo. But thanks to this work, she'd be on that short list of scientists who are household names. But then she looked around and saw that she was alone in the lab. No one was there. No one was at home either. There was no one to celebrate with. In fact, everyone in the lab or her field would probably spend the next few years questioning her and trying to prove her wrong. She'd be pilloried for a decade at least before she was eventually celebrated. Whether it was heliocentrism or plate tectonics, it all followed the same path. Scientists are crucified before they're celebrated, and if they're lucky, that celebration isn't posthumous. She had no one to buttress her against the attacks coming her way. No one who would be instinctively on her side. No one, she thought, except Will. It was that night she caught the train to D.C., and it was the next day when she showed up at Will's office he'd told her about Astrid. He'd chosen someone else. "You had someone warm, and I'd chosen a block of ice," she said. "Nothing colder." Well, I mean, there's plenty colder. It's not even that cold on the Kelvin scale, but you know what I mean. That's how it felt in the moment. She was agitated with both her doubt and grief on the train back to Pittsburgh. When she was back in the lab, she just stared at the empty platform. Erin couldn't have said what gave her the idea, but a few weeks later the idea of a second chance had taken hold. And once it was in her head, she couldn't let it go. But how? She didn't want to go back in time herself. That got complicated in ways she couldn't foresee. Would she have to kill her original self or something? She ruled that out as a non-starter. But her experiments with space-time showed that there might be another way. Perhaps instead of sending something back in time, she could just reset time back a year. She spent the final few months of the year working toward that goal. By the morning of December 30th, 1999 she was ready for a reset, which was close enough to the end of the calendar year that she decided to wait an extra day for sentimental reasons. It would feel good to redo the entire year. She spent the last day tidying her apartment, even though she expected she wouldn't return. She made final notes on her experiments, even though no one would ever see them. And then she set the trigger for her reset to begin right after 11 hours, 59 minutes, 59 seconds, eager for her second chance at a rough year. She paused her story there. Will wiped his face. He wiggled his hand. "Reset time a year like it was no big deal? You said to present it as if I were talking to a cable news audience." "Fair enough. Did you test this insane idea before you reset Earth's time?" "I can't say for sure, but there is some data to suggest that I tested it several times in late November." "Why can't you say for sure?" "Because I don't consciously remember doing it. But the evidence of temporal distortion is there. So what probably happened is I reset time for an hour or two, let's say. It's hard to tell for sure. But if I wasn't conscious of the reset at the time, I wouldn't have done anything differently. Time would have reset, but I wouldn't have been aware of it while it replayed. But what good would that have done? If I had reset time without remembering this year, nothing would have changed. I had to figure out how to remember the year so I could make a different choice. I needed to keep my consciousness intact through the reset. That was the goal. But then everyone remembered, Will finished. She nodded and looked out the window. He suddenly remembered her first question to him at the start of 1999B. You remembered it too? I didn't know we'd all be affected, she said quietly. Nevertheless, she lived 1999B the way she intended, with Will. She was not going to let anything stand in the way of her second chance, so while the physicists were all studying the temporal phenomenon, she could focus on her new path. Until 1999C, that is. That was the first indication that they were trapped in an end loop, and that it wasn't just a one-time blip. The realization of what she'd done weighed on her. She'd fled from Will and thrown herself back into her work. She eventually came to the conclusion that she needed to be in the exact same position she'd been in when she'd triggered the time loop to start with. She closed out the year as close to the same as she could remember doing it the first time, and yet the year repeated. Her efforts weren't enough. The time loop continued. Will saw where the story was going. That's when you asked me to get together with Astrid, Will said, and to kiss her on New Year's Eve like I did the first time. You were in the same place, but it wasn't enough to stop things from repeating. So you wanted to see if having me in the right place as well would have any effect. She nodded. Nothing worked, she said. Nothing is working. And a year is such a long time. It takes so long to get new data. They were both silent again. So now what? Will asked. More, she said. More of us at the same place on December 31st. That's all I can think to do. Will couldn't handle it. He walked out. Out in the world, the new 1999 was going terribly. What was it? F? Will thought it was, but it was getting hard to remember. It might have been G. Before, those with money in the bank had taken the year off. Now everyone was starting to get into the game. Bands of men in masks roamed the street with guns. They took what they wanted, whether it was food or sex. In response, groups of people, usually families and single women, pooled their resources and took over apartments, condos, and other buildings, setting up their own security at the door. By the spring, the streets weren't safe at night. By the fall, they weren't safe in the day either. The trappings of a so-called normal life were falling apart. The next 1999 started with an apology, or an attempt at it. Erin did her best through her tears, apologizing to Will as much as she was to the world, but she didn't get far. They heard gunshots from somewhere down the hall, then screams. Panicked people ran past the door. Will slammed the door closed and they both threw themselves against it. Who brings a gun to a New Year's Eve party? Will whispered. They waited. Only once did the door handle jiggle. Erin and Will held their breath, but no one entered. They survived the night, but not the year. In March, Erin was killed by the driver of a stolen Cadillac doing 90 in downtown Pittsburgh, the fifth pedestrian he'd mowed down in his joyride. 2 months later, Will was killed while covering a story in suburban Virginia. The next several 1999s all ended similarly and abruptly for them. There was another nuclear war once, because apparently the first one didn't take. Often Erin and Will didn't even make it through January. There was violence or disaster waiting for them at every turn. A small miracle that the year started with something as nice as a kiss, even if it descended into a nightmare so quickly. There was no time and no place for Erin to continue her research. Just making it to spring was a minor victory. Karma just didn't mean anything anymore. Everywhere had become the Wild West. The start of each new 1999 became an arms race. Supplies and weapons were just lying around, waiting to be picked up. Grab what you could and then hole up somewhere safe. Repeat as needed. Small fiefdoms dotted the entire landscape. Aaron and Will spent these years working together to survive. In 1999 they eventually joined up with a group that occupied and fortified the U.S. Naval Observatory. The Secret Service took Vice President Gore from his home on the observatory circle and abandoned the area. The security apparatus in the area remained functional, though, making it a good place to safely ride out the year. The Army patrolled central D.C., and the worst offenders kept their distance. In that no-man's land, the observatory was an almost peaceful retreat, and they lived there a few years in a row. And while they couldn't make it through the year alive there, Erin was dismayed that she had very few of the resources she needed to continue her research, but staying alive was challenging enough. In November of 1999 Q or R or so, Erin sat Will down. "You need to put me on TV." "What good is that going to do? There's no broadcast signal anymore." "There will be in January. If we're quick enough, we can get a message out on the airwaves. Instead of coming here next year, let's aim for your office." Will thought about it. To what end? To spread the truth. People need to know what happened. "It won't do any good, Aaron. And when they hear your story, people are going to absolutely hate you. They're going to come after you. You're going to make yourself a target forever. They should hate me. I hate me right now. You hate me right now." "I don't hate you," Will said, though it sounded hollow, even to him. "Would I be working with you like we have if I did?" "You can barely look at me anymore, Will. You're always looking somewhere else, or your eyes aren't focused on mine, even if they're pointed in the right direction." "It's not hate. It's awe, I guess. Maybe some fear, if I'm honest. It's like you told me you were the reincarnation of Cleopatra. It's a nonsense claim normally, except that you have the asp bites to prove it. And then you tell me I'm your Mark Antony. I'm just supposed to roll with it? That's really specific. Okay, fine. Let's say you date this great guy, and a little while later he's elected president, except you didn't even know he was running. But he tells you he did it for you, and now he wonders if he should nuke Russia for you as well. How would you respond?" Aaron slowly nodded. "Look, it's been a few years since I told you." "More than a few," he corrected. "Fine, more than a few," she said. "Not that we've been alive for that whole time. And I've been able to do a lot of thinking since then. You're not Mark Antony to my Cleopatra, or whatever you want to call it. I'm sorry if that's what you took from what I told you. Yes, I wanted to get things right with you. But there's so much more I wanted to fix. It wasn't just that I was missing a lover. I was missing friends, a life. How many times did we dine out during our second chance? I loved it because I almost never did it before. I ate all my meals out of the microwave in the lab. I never just really enjoyed my life outside of my work. I never clocked off early and took a walk or watched a movie." "You know, you didn't have to reset time to do those things," Will said. "No, I suppose not. But I had a wonderful new tool in front of me. It didn't occur to me to walk away. Press this button, Will, and you get a second chance at everything. Or don't, and find it in yourself to change even though you haven't managed to do very well at that so far. How would you respond?" They sat together, quiet. "You really think that telling people the truth is going to fix anything?" he asked. "If we're going to start this, we can't start from a lie. It's at the core of science." "Yeah," Will said. "That's what I'm afraid of. But we may as well try. Let's get you ready for prime time." Will and Aaron planned their every move. When the new year rang in, they already knew their best route out of Caleb's home, out the window of the parlor, and then their route into the capital, southeast on Massachusetts Avenue until they crossed Rock Creek. Will's network offices with their satellite uplink to New York and the rest of the world was waiting at the end. In 1998, the drive might have taken an hour in traffic. They went on foot, and it took them 5. When Will and Aaron arrived, they found a man and a woman ready to make the network's secure building their home for the year. Will dimly recognized them as old co-workers. He realized he hadn't been in the office in years. Fortunately, they recognized him too, and he was able to dragoon them into service. Together, they got an interview room and prepped for him and Aaron. Normally, a live broadcast would take a dozen people to pull off, with the team ready to go in mere minutes. With just 4 of them working, it took them until noon to have the equipment set up correctly. "All right," Will said, sucking in his breath. "Let's see if anyone's watching." Will interviewed Aaron for 35 minutes. She explained what she'd done and why the year was repeating. She invited other scientists to help. She explained what she thought needed to be done, and while she urged everyone to get to their same places, as at the end of 1999A, she pleaded with the public not to kill anyone who hadn't survived the first year. "There's no evidence anyone needs to die. We'll never be able to kill our way out of this," she concluded. The broadcast left the studio live, and all the equipment seemed to suggest it was beamed to the satellites and out into the world. But who knew if anyone bothered to turn on a television set to see it? Will set it up to broadcast on repeat. It was the best they could do. "To the observatory again?" he asked Aaron. That was when the army broke down the door. Someone had been watching. The military had the equipment and the resources to monitor national communications, despite the general breakdown of society around them. With no explanation given, the squad escorted Aaron and Will out of the studio and to a waiting helicopter. That took them to a waiting cargo jet. In less than an hour from the time their broadcast ended, the two were en route to Scott Air Force Base outside of St. Louis. The U.S.-based physicists and theorists the government had tapped to break the time loop were scattered all over the country on January 1st. Extraction plans had been developed for each scientist, though nothing was on paper since it would just reset every January 1st, so that they could be safely brought together at the beginning of each new year to continue their research. Scott Air Force Base was close to the center of the country and made it an ideal place to quickly gather the researchers who were predominantly split between the east and west coasts. Those who had arrived before Aaron and Will immediately convened a panel to interview her. It was entirely made up of men, almost all old enough to be Aaron's father or grandfather. Aaron did most of the talking and used concepts and language that went far over Will's head, but she deflected every inquiry into the mechanics and theoretical ideas underpinning how she had manipulated space-time. A few accused her of gaslighting them and claimed that she was wasting their time. They tested her, questioning her on other scientific concepts related to the field, and she fiercely proved her depth of knowledge and insight was far greater than theirs. She convinced the most stubborn skeptic, but her own work was a black box. The interviews ended in the middle of the night with everyone upset. "If they understood what you did, they might be able to help more," Will said when they were together in their room, though with the guard outside the door. Will thought it was perhaps best described as a cell. Aaron shook her head vehemently. "Think about the mess I made. And that was just me. Think of what the government, any government, not just ours, could do with the same power. I can't tell them a thing." A court convened on the base and tried Aaron for crimes against humanity and found her guilty. President Gore called her personally to give her assurances that if she cooperated and helped them break the time loop, the technology would not be used by the U.S. government. He promised a full pardon. She declined and was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that would begin on January 1st, 2000. Until then, she'd live on the Air Force Base with the other researchers. While avoiding any further information about the experiments themselves, Aaron continued to insist that the only way out was to recreate the final moments of 1999A as best as possible. The assembled scientists reviewed everything they could, barring the details that Aaron refused to share, and eventually came to the same conclusion. This was their way out. In April, the U.S. began a massive public relations campaign, the likes of which hadn't been seen since World War II. All airwaves broadcast the message through the emergency alert system. Leaflets were dropped from planes over major cities. The cooperation of other governments around the world was sought and secured. In just a few short months, the hope of rolling over the calendar to the year 2000 was powerful enough to begin to stitch society back together. TV and radio news stations assembled their teams and began to broadcast again. Cities secured the streets from the vigilante violence that had characterized the last few years. Major freeways were made passable once again. The chance to break the time loop was a powerful incentive for rebuilding and reconnecting. An overwhelming majority of folks were working to pick up the pieces, and yet a stubborn faction tried to fight the attempt to reach 2000. The leaders of the Restoration, who in theory should have been on board with the plan, were upset they didn't get to kill everyone who had died in 1999A, and they disparaged the effort. The Enlightened, too, were less than zen about the plan. Greeting January 1st, 2000 meant the loss of immortality. They took to the streets to protest. Meanwhile, still others refused to believe the news. Why hadn't Aaron come forward earlier? Was the American public really supposed to believe that some random woman in her 20s had somehow created a massive worldwide crisis from a humble lab in a humble town? The worldwide Y2K bug was certainly the true cause of the time loop, and this new plan was some sort of government smokescreen. As the end of 1999T approached, the global effort to recreate 1999A ramped up. Save for the Y2K conspiracy kooks, the Restoration, and the Enlightened, the world had a unified vision. Erin was given a release from the Air Force Base in order to return to her lab and get into position. If the plan was successful, she'd spend the rest of her life in prison. Will and Astrid met up again with an awkward greeting. "Your girlfriend plunged the world into a never-ending time loop because you and I got together?" she asked Will. It's a lot more complicated than that," he said. "This is the kind of baggage I'm trying to avoid, Will." "Astrid, I just put the movie on," she said. They watched Rebecca. They kissed. And he was right back to kissing Erin in the parlor again. They'd failed. The world had failed. But there wasn't time to stew on it. "We have to get you out of here," Will whispered fiercely. "Everyone here knows now, and at least one of them has a gun." They fled through the window, and not a moment too soon, judging by the sound of gunshots that chased them into the night. The army picked them up before anyone else was able to take a shot at them. "I really thought we had enough people doing their part," Will said on the plane to Scott Air Force Base. "But I guess there were just too many idiots out there not willing to go along with a plan." Erin didn't respond. Her eyes were closed. "We can convince them this time," Will said, trying to cajole her. "Or if we can't, we'll force them. We'll get mandates in place, or whatever we need. We can do this." "It's never going to work," Erin whispered. "There will never be enough people complying. If we couldn't get it the first time, we're going to have less compliance next time, not more. We tried. It failed. So why do that again? That's human nature." "You can't give up, Erin," Will said. "I'm not giving up, but I have a new idea to try." Will was getting used to her big ideas now. Which is, give the government what they want. At the Air Force Base, the new interview panel went very differently. Erin requested a whiteboard, and she used it to take the men through some of the theories that underpinned her work. That took 3 days. Finally, when it seemed to Will as if she had reached the limits of their understanding, she suggested she just start fabrication and show them what she had done. Everything she asked for she got, including transferring the entire operation to her familiar lab at Carnegie Mellon. Another plane ride. "I thought you said you didn't trust what the government is going to do with this technology," Will asked. "I don't trust them. Nothing's changed. So why give them the keys?" Erin was quiet. "Do you know what year this is?" she asked eventually. He looked at her like she was crazy. "Humor me," she said. 1999? 1999 U, if you want to be specific?" "No. I don't follow." "It should be 2020. We've been doing this for 21 years. Will was dumbfounded. "That just feels impossibly far into the future." "I have the same thought. 2020 is supposed to have, I don't know, flying cars and jetpacks, vacations to the moon, but here we are. I was born in 1971. I'm 28, but I'm not. I'm 49, living inside the body of a 28-year-old. That's the dream of a lot of people." Erin shook her head firmly. "Not mine. I'm not afraid of aging." "What about the hard stop at the end of it?" She shook her head again. although after a short pause. It's the natural order. Everything dies. Us, animals, trees, the sun, whole galaxies. I'm not trying to escape it. The woman who invented time travel never thought about using it to cheat death. Death comes for us all, even the time traveler. But think what you could see in the meantime. Think what you could break. They were silent again. There's no death here, Will ventured. In this time loop, I mean, the enlightened may actually have been right about that. Erin shook her head. No, we're surrounded by death here. How many times have you and I died? How many times have we watched our friends and neighbors die? I'm living under constant death threats. You said it yourself. Biology and psychology are at odds. We're not meant to live like this. What happens in 1,000 years or 100,000? What do the 7-year-olds do when their minds are as old as Methuselah, but they're still in a body designed to run around in the woods and get scraped knees? It won't work. So what then? Will pressed. Give this technology to the government? Not a chance. Will threw up his hands. Then I don't see why you're jumping into bed with them. No one else could build me a time machine, she said. No one else could assemble the resources in less than a year. And in this environment, it's not even close. I need them to build it. Will thought about it. You're going to use it before they can? She was impassive and silent. He took that expression as a yes. What are you going to do then? The only option left. It took until May, but Erin got her time machine built. Every piece of material that was needed was procured by the federal government, either through the markets or requisitioned with its military might. They scheduled their first test for Friday, May 21st, 1999 U. On Wednesday night, Erin seduced Will. To Will, they had started to feel like an old married couple, chased after 2 decades together. As they kissed and their bare skin pressed against each other, the spark they'd had in 1999 came back. It was as if they suddenly remembered their bodies were still in their 20s, even if their minds had lived half a lifetime. Afterward, they lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. That was goodbye, wasn't it? Will asked. She didn't answer, and he again took it as a yes. Friday? Tomorrow, she answered. The day before they think we're running the first test. They don't know enough to see it coming, and it will be over before they realize what I've done. To what end? She sighed. I told you about the block of ice. I sent it back through time. But then, when it came to changing my own past, I had a choice about how to proceed. I could go back, kill myself, and then replace myself in the timeline. I dismissed that, for obvious reasons. Instead, I figured out a way to reset space-time, so I didn't have to go through that unpleasant task. And we saw how that turned out. So now I've come to realize the only option left is the road not taken. Will sat up. You don't mean. I'm going back. Not a reset. I'm going to send myself to very late 1998. I was a pretty solitary creature back then, alone in the lab most hours. I have a good sense of where to find myself, and I'll do the deed. Take care of the remains as quietly as I can. Then I'll relive 1999 again as close as I can to my original path. I'll meet you on New Year's Eve. We'll date. I'll go back to Pittsburgh. I'll come visit, and we'll go see that poor panda bear, which will put you in a funk again. I wasn't in a funk. You were, like a little kid. You'll break up with me, I'll send a block of ice through time. I'll try to get back to you, and I'll sit there while you tell me about Astrid. I'll do everything as close to 1999 as I can, except that at the stroke of midnight, I won't flip the switch. Instead, I'll dismantle this stupid thing and burn all my research, and then the world will get on with it. It solves everything. What about me? Do I remember any of what happened in this scenario? Will asked eventually. No one will but me, since I will have gone back in time instead of resetting space-time. And since I'm going back to before the time loop started, it will be as if this whole mess never happened. Will looked around the shabby room. I know it's been awful in a million ways, but 20 years of my life just deleted in a blip? He shook his head. I don't like it. I know, she said quietly. That's why I told you. Why? She rolled over and put her fingers through his hair. I wanted you to have the chance to stop me, she said. He saw a thick film over her eyes. Because we won't be together in the other life. Not for longer than a few months of 1999. We might still get back together. I don't know that Astrid and I were going to make it long into the year 2000, honestly, Will said. Erin shrugged. Maybe, she said. But Will could tell she didn't believe it. Inertia was a powerful force. So powerful that most people would pass up a chance at something amazing because to reach for it would cause a minor inconvenience in the moment. And then if they understood what they'd missed, they'd probably pray for a second chance, not realizing they would probably let that one pass by them too. Sometimes it felt easier to blow up the universe than make the 1,000 small choices in a day that would make one's life better. He kissed her. Then they rested. I won't stop you, Will said eventually. Asking you to stay and find another way, a way that preserves our memories, at least yours and mine, feels like the most selfish thing in the world. To choose having 20 years of memory over what the world's been through? I can't do it. Erin shook her head. Neither can I. Will thought about it. But I'm not the one who has to go back in time and kill myself and secretly dispose of the body. You're sure you can do that? And then relive 1999 as if you've never been through it before? Knowingly walk into all that pain? And then be the only one who remembers what happened? I have to, she said simply. They were quiet again. How will I know it worked? Will asked. You won't. No one will except me. But if the world ever sees the year 2000, or even the year 2020, it will have worked. Erin? Will asked. Oh my God, it is you, isn't it? Hello. Will pulled his cloth mask down to show his smiling face. Do you remember me? Will from... Of course, you're Will from 1999, she said. It took him a moment to catch her drift and understand her name for him. Oh, wow, the 90s. Has it really been that long? He asked with a laugh. It had been so long. In fact, his beanie was hiding a receding hairline, and around her eyes were new crow's feet that hadn't been there in 1999. Do you want to step outside for a second and talk where we won't have to worry about, Will said, flipping his hand back and forth, indicating the COVID-19 virus for which no one was yet vaccinated against. She understood immediately what he meant. Outside the grocery store, there was a firm winter wind. It was a cold December 31st, and yet they both took off their masks and tentatively hugged, their faces carefully pointed away from each other. Will hadn't hugged anyone but his wife in months, and it felt good, better than it should with an old flame. But maybe that was the way of it when, after so long apart, you met up with someone you had once deeply cared for. God, more than 20 years. I can't believe it, he said. The two separated and put a few steps of distance between them. What brings you back to D.C.? Will asked. I'm part of the resistance now, she said. Resistance to Trump, you mean? Well, certainly, yes. But only because someone like that shouldn't ever have his hands on the trigger. But it's been growing a lot longer than that. A year or so after we were together, I quit my research life and started writing for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. He cocked his head to one side, questioning. We're the ones that update the doomsday clock. You know the one I mean? Oh, sure, about the threat of nuclear war. He put his forearm up almost vertically and then began ticking it forward. 5 minutes to midnight, 4 minutes to midnight, all that. Not just nuclear war, climate change, all this. She waved her hand as he had, now accepted as the universal sign to indicate the current shitty state of the world. And the clock is down to 100 seconds right now, actually. It's astonishing how close our society lives to the brink of collapse, as this year should prove. Will blinked. Sorry to be a downer, she said with a guilty smile. Part of the job. Though I try to emphasize the positive stories as much as I can these days so it's not so bleak. We need some amount of hope if we're going to persevere, don't you think? Will rubbed his cheek. I'm not very hopeful right now. Then I'll work harder. Aaron said with the same earnestness he remembered from the first night he met her. I've seen some absolutely horrible things. But I've seen them improve, too. I'm not giving up. Will tried to process that. It's wild. On one hand, you're exactly how I remember, and on the other, whatever happened to putting a massive dent in our understanding of the known universe or whatever that was? Erin's face darkened and she looked down. Will wondered if he'd gone too far. He didn't have the trophy case full of awards either. Maybe no one liked to be reminded of their dreams. I'm sorry if he started, but she waved him off. Not at all. Honestly, I did do that. Not in a way that I could explain easily, she said with a wry laugh, but I did. Aaron stopped short before eventually saying, I guess that rather than increase humanity's understanding of the universe, I decided I'd rather devote my time to making sure we still exist. The research won't matter if we're not here to benefit from it. You don't do things halfway, do you? Will said, shaking his head in wonder. Well, someone taught me the power of the media to reach people, and it inspired me to be an early blogger for the Bulletin. I guess I should thank you for that. What? Really? I'm honored, he said, then laughed, trying to dispel the awkward sincerity with which her statement was delivered. I actually got out of the media rat race a long time ago. I'm doing internal corporate communications for... it doesn't matter. It's boring, but it's work, you know. She smiled. And are you settled down? Are you still with... What was her name again? Will could tell immediately that she was acting, and he had a flashback to her pained look after she'd come to see him that morning so many years ago. She knew perfectly well the name she meant, but he understood why she went through the fiction. Oh, yeah, Astrid, you mean? No, we only lasted a couple years. I met Wendy a little later. We're over by DuPont Circle. It's the two of us with an 8 and an 11-year-old all crammed into a small space trying to work and school from home. It's nuts, but also sort of great. Same old story. He laughed. What about you? Married or anything? Yes, Patrick. We met at an Iraq war protest. Feels like a lifetime ago. Ah, that's wonderful, Aaron. Congrats. Thanks, and no kids, just the two of us. And you're both surviving 2020 all right? He asked. I mean, it's 2020 finally, which is a miracle in and of itself. Where's my flying car and jetpack, right? She said with a knowing laugh. He felt like it was a joke he was supposed to get, but didn't quite. He smiled instead. She looked pained for a moment, deeply saddened by something. She recovered and smiled back, and they just gazed at each other. He could tell they were drinking in a final look at each other, ready to part. There would be no, let's do this again sometime. Well, I should... He pointed back into the store, and she nodded. Absolutely. Yeah, it's good to bump into you, she said. You too, he said. They tentatively hugged again. Oh, and Happy New Year. I guess New Year's Eve is sort of our holiday. He laughed. She smiled again, tears in her eyes, though it could have been from the cold, he thought. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow is our day. Tomorrow? January 1st? But we met on New Year's Eve, December 31st. I know. I just don't celebrate New Year's Eve anymore. Wow, you really are part of the resistance, he said. She smiled. Every time the calendar rolls over to a new year and we're all still alive and breathing, that's worth celebrating. He smiled. I'll remember that. Tomorrow, then. He gave a sort of formal and deferential bow. Good to see you, Aaron, from 1999. She nodded back, also deeply. And you as well, Will, from 1999. Happy New Year. About the author. Erik Hanberg lives in Tacoma, Washington, with his wife Mary and 2 children. In addition to writing, he served 12 years on the Metro Parks Board of Tacoma and works for his local public radio station. Find him at erikhandberg.com or on Twitter @ErikHandberg.